Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the official Oscarina nomination coverage for Street Fighter 2. Being a cultural icon, Street Fighter 2 is a fighting game that needs no introduction, but in the spirit of fairness and completeness, we're going to give you an overview anyways. Street Fighter 2 was developed and published by Capcom for arcade cabinets in 1991. However, due to Academy rules, arcade games are ineligible to compete until they have a console or PC-based release, at which time they must compete under a home release port. This unfortunately does hurt the game's overall performance, as we'll see in a moment with its limited nominations. However, console ports of the game come in a wide range of quality, since there are, to my knowledge, at least 8 different ports of the game. Some add new characters, other adjust balancing and speed. Our conversation is mostly going to pertain to Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which is what I have on the Super Nintendo Classic Edition. That's the footage you're seeing here. Generally considered among the better ports, this is primarily the version I played, though I've also played new challengers a bit because you get some new characters, which is always a win. For what it's worth, Street Fighter 2 saw tournament play as recent as 2022. That's 30 years worth of staying power, and that's a kind of cultural and historical influence that really should not be overlooked at the Oscarinas. Famous last words. My name is Mitchell, and I'm your host for the evening. I've got Noah with me here today. How are you doing, Noah?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks for allowing me to record with you again.
Yeah, no problem. So, Street Fighter 2 has 2 nominations, and they are for Best Pixel and Best Music Track for Guile's theme. However, Street Fighter 2 also has the bronze win for Best Female Character for Chun-Li. So Chun-Li is not currently nominated. All of the Best Female Character nominees are from 1993, though. So this means that Chun-Li, being at the top of the ticket for 92, makes her the default winner for 92, assuming 93 contenders were eliminated. So that's kind of interesting that we already see it walk away with at least something. But as you can see, we've only got 2 nominations here. It's pretty slim. You know, there's a couple reasons for that. The big one, of course, is that it's an arcade game, but it's not just that it's in arcades, it's mostly that the game favors multiplayer experiences, and it's very much a product of its time, specifically in terms of recapturing that experience is really hard to do. And so we're looking at it mostly from the modern lens, but, you know, respect where respect is owed comes at the same point. So we're going to be talking about a number of different things that validate its claim for Best Pixel, and that's going to bleed into a number of different categories. The other thing is that Corbett was the big proponent for Guile's theme for Best Music Track, so I'm going to have him jump onto the conversation in a little bit and just give his spiel. He recorded that separately, and so I'll just drop that in here, and then we'll come back to Noah and I. So in the meantime, let's just give everyone a brief overview of our experience with the game. So Noah, you've not really played this until very recently, is that right?
Yeah, I'm not a big fighting guy in terms of video games. The most I've ever really played was Super Smash Bros. And like Injustice 2. So I've seen a lot on this game because a couple of my friends really love this game, and I'm really glad that I did try it out because it was a blast. It was really tough, surprisingly. I was not expecting that. It was really enjoyable to play through, and my only thing is I really wish I played it on the actual arcade system. Like, that experience could completely outmatch the experience on a emulator.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, fighting games I do think are very challenging if A, you're not used to them, and B, if you are just trying to come to grips with the controls. I struggled a little bit with this one, but I started to adapt when I went to gather footage, and I found it better to just stick with a character whose moves I felt like I could pull off, namely Ryu and Chun-Li, and a little bit of E-Honda in there. And so once I started to kind of relax into my groove, that's when it came through. Something I usually do with fighting games is when I play a character, you know, I just mess around, I smash buttons. I'm not very good at fighting games in general, but I smash some buttons around until I see a move or two that I like, and then I go through their move list and I try to learn just 1 or 2 moves, and I practice those over and over and over. And it's very redundant, but I'm trying to get it into my muscle memory. And then once I've got a couple moves into my muscle memory, I can go back and add a few more in. And I think actually I want to start a little bit by talking about the sort of pitch that it had for best gameplay discovery and expression. The kind of big thing is that you have a unique character roster, and that was a very novel concept for fighting games of the time. Because the characters lean into cartoonish / stereotypical references rather than genuine cultural representation, they're able to exude a great deal of creativity in their moves and abilities. For example, Dolly can stretch his arms while Blanca can create static electricity like Pikachu. It's very cool to see a game that really changed the landscape of fighting games, where traditionally you would just have two fighters, usually they're the same character model, and Street Fighter 2 came out and said, no, each fighter needs to be unique, they need to have a lot of personality, they need to have a lot of characteristics, they need to be an attractive character for audiences to go up and want to play. And so this is a big win in the art department, right? Because it's art that propels Street Fighter 2 into the limelight instead of just focusing so much on the mechanics. That's something I really appreciate about it.
When I play fighter games, I do my best not to spam, but occasionally I have to. But I noticed that every now and then, like, I'll do a couple buttons and automatically I'll just do like a random combo. And so I kind of looked into it, and it turns out that every now and then, without pushing the proper buttons, you'll be able to do combos. And so after learning that, I kind of went through the different movesets, and I think that's why I enjoyed this game out of all the other ones, was because learning the movesets was not too difficult, but it felt really rewarding rather than just, well, I used Dalsim, so I just kind of used range to my advantage. But after learning some of the moves, I enjoyed the game a lot more.
Yeah, that was something that they did intentionally with the original arcade cabinets, was make it so that you would accidentally pull off a special combo or like a big move without even intending to. There's like a very slim chance that it'll happen just randomly. And because of that, a player would notice it happen and then think to themselves, oh, that was interesting. How did I do that? And it was a way to kind of prompt them to figure out the other moves that the character could do. So that's a really great point you bring up about the discovery elements for the game. Because, you know, it's exciting to be playing a character and then you get a little bit of a win here. Obviously, that makes it less competitive, but it is exciting to recognize that there's more to each character than you initially realize. And that's also leading into fighting games in general. You know, the nature of finding a character you enjoy playing in a competitive space encourages a much greater sense of personal attachment and expression. In a fighting game, you don't sit down to master the game, you master a character, and a part of that process is enjoying the avatar you synergize with. And this is very commonplace nowadays, where people say, you know, oh, I main this particular character, as in I play them all the time, and, you know, I consider myself an expert of playing this character. That all started back here with Street Fighter 2. So it's definitely got the chops where it comes to gameplay. It's a little bit harder to quantify its gameplay nomination status for something like challenge and achievement, because ultimately the challenge is going to boil down to playing with other people. There is a single player mode, but I don't think that maintains its luster for very long. And then in terms of our new category, fellowship and relaxation, I don't think it's a relaxing game because it's pretty tense, but and I don't know if it's quite fellowship in the cooperative sense, but it is a good space if you want to beat up your friends for a little bit. For lack of a better way to phrase that.
Yeah, I definitely wish I played with someone else, because, yeah, I could definitely say that the single player experience only gets so far.
Yeah, that's honestly a problem just with today's gaming landscape. There's, you know, we're all kind of in different locations, and so finding time to sit down and have us play a game together is really tough. And generally, when it comes down to it, if I'm going to get footage and I want it myself, I just have to play it solo, which is fine. I don't mind doing it, but it is one of those things that's, I don't know, a bit of a shame. You know, and as we kind of move on to talk a little bit about the art direction for the game, one thing that I think is very cool is in a lot of the stages, you have in the background characters like cheering on the fight and sort of rooting for different people. And it's kind of like what would have been happening in real life if you go into an arcade and you got two people going head to head, especially if they're really good. You start to gather a crowd and everybody's watching to see who can pull ahead. You know, that's a really cool, infectious, exciting time to live in. And it's one of those things that it's awesome that art can do that, but kind of a shame that, you know, it has to be lost to time and that it's hard to recreate nowadays, you know?
I love it when there's like these huge tournaments for these fighting games. The thing I know most about Street Fighter 2 was there's this huge tournament that went on, and this guy was literally on 1 HP, and he perfect parried Chun-Li's move like 5 times in a row, and then after that he KO'd and won the whole tournament. And in that video, the entire crowd goes wild, and I'm like, dude, it would have been so cool to be a part of that. Like, that is something that you can't experience ever again, really.
I know. Yeah, fighting games have definitely stayed around a long time because of Street Fighter 2, but like you're saying, in it allows for these kinds of moments to happen, and that's what gets people really stoked, is when someone just pulls off something crazy. I've always kind of held this belief that fighting games are in some ways like the purest form of video games, because it's just choose an avatar to embody and then get into the gameplay right away. And there's so little pomp and circumstance for a lot of fighting games that I kind of think that they're in some ways of pure of heart, just because they want to get zero focused on the actual play experience. And because they're often competitive, that also lends to it, because it's the kind of experience that you can't do in other formats or media. So even though like competitive games are not a big sell here at the Oscarinas, I do have a personal admiration for them, because I do think it's a very important aspect of game design. And speaking of, too, when you're choosing your character, the characters truly are the stars, freely towing the line of realism with iconography that creates a playful and lighthearted representation of the globe's fighters. Fighting styles are pulled from various cultures and even exaggerated outside of this for fancy special moves.
Yeah, and the characters were built in 6 chunks and attached together, making it not only more difficult to create their unique animations, but also giving them more realized character model, sort of similar to like a G.I. Joe action figure.
Yeah, that was really interesting too. In a lot of the research that I was doing, this was something that came up where they had to draw just each character in just these segments so they can't look at the whole picture, which is a pain in the butt, because it would be nice if you could just see your entire character that you're working on. And instead it's like I have to reference the sketch and then build it out of pixels in just this little portion, and then save that, and then do a different portion. But, you know, what this amounts to is that the character models are really elaborate and just very nicely detailed. And so there's clearly a lot of love put into each one of them to make them stand out and be distinct and interesting and comparative with one another.
Yeah, and even I saw a video on how they created the game, and it's really interesting how because they only have so much like memory storage, and so they would literally create the sketch, the animations, and put it on like a physical memory card so they could see how much of the animation they could fit in. And I just think that level of dedication is so cool. You care so much about how the animation looks for an arcade game, and it turns out beautifully. I think all the animations are really clean.
They truly are. That's interesting that they went that far with it. I mean, this was clearly a labor of love. I mean, even when we're talking about the backgrounds, there's so much put into each of these stages. It's just really, really easy on the eyes. It's super nice.
They're busy but clean, and they make the stage incredibly unique and lively, each having their own animations during the fight and separate animations when the fight ends. So some of the examples are like the elephants that use their nose to like sound like a horn and praise the fighter in Dhalsim's level, or most noticeable is in Chun-Li's level, where like everyone is doing their own chores. There's merchants trying to sell stuff, there's chickens flying around, and occasionally like a bicycle comes by. And I think this is the only game this year, or these 2 years, that like the background is actually something cool to look at, and going into each stage kind of feels refreshing because it's not the same thing every single time. And this also helps to add the feeling that you're traveling around the world as opposed to simply being taken to some non-existent reality.
Yeah, I was just going to say that it really does capture something awesome when you get to go across the whole globe. You become the champion, you beat up all the other fighters, right? And it's like, okay, I took out this person all the way from Brazil. Now I'm flying over to Japan. Now I'm going to duke it out with this guy. It's kind of exciting premise that they have. And, you know, the music shows up to back them up in this too. The score encompasses a number of inspired tracks that each harken back to the culture for which the character comes from. And while it's not a one-to-one authentic recreation of music from around the globe, it instead allows for freedom of expression. At 21 years old, Yoko Shimomura was given a large degree of freedom to write music that is familiar to a culture, but largely just inspired by it. This allows the music to first adhere to the form of the game, and secondly, add dashes of flavor. To use a food analogy, it's basically Asian fusion cuisine. And then, of course, we have Guile's theme, which is up for Best Music Track, and so we're going to pause here, and we're going to let Corbett give his piece on that.
The Oscarinas have nominated the CPS2 version of Guile's theme for Best Musical Track. Street Fighter II was first released on home consoles in 1992 And the CPS2 version of Street Fighter II was released in 1993, so this version of the song is still eligible for this year's Game Awards ceremony. The gameplay of Street Fighter II is a one-on-one fighting game, as I'm sure most of you already know. To me, Guile's theme represents the concentrated essence of the training montage song. My interpretation of the different instrumentation is as follows. The song has a dirty-sounding bass, which represents gritty hard work. It has airy background chimes, which represent the aspirational dreams that you strive towards while you train. And at the center of the song, it has confident guitar and synth melodies, which represent competency and superhuman determination. Personally, I love art that makes us better people, and a song that helps motivate me to improve myself is very in line with that preference. Aside from my personal enjoyment of the song also has quite a large realm of influence and reputation. There is a meme called Guile's Theme Goes With Anything, where many other people have found the song to be a fitting backdrop to many epic feats of skill, conflict, and victory against the odds. If you type in Guile's Theme Goes With Everything on YouTube, and you look at some of the most viewed results, you'll see one mashup video that has 14 million views, 9 other mashup videos with over 1 million views, and countless others with less than 1 million views. These are some of the highlights of why I think it deserves Best Song, but at the end of the day, it's better that you just listen for yourself and make your own judgment.
And so that's most of our thoughts on the music. I will say, though, that it also has this feature where there's a sped up version of each track, which occurs once one of the characters is low in health. And that makes the fight that much more intense the closer they are to reaching the end. I did feel like this kicks in maybe a little bit too early, but that's also just a result of playing really well and beating your opponent right out of the get-go. And then I think that just leaves us to talk a little bit about Chun-Li. So as mentioned before, Chun-Li is our bronze winner. It's interesting to be talking about a nominee after they've already won at least something. So she was at the top of the ticket, as I said before, among 1992 contenders. Not quite enough to make the nominee slot, but she was definitely next in line. You know, it's a little bit harder to work in a fighting game character into a character-focused category. Not because they aren't interesting or that there's not enough to talk about it, but simply because it's harder to showcase that, and it's harder to present arguments that everybody can, I think, fully grasp in at least a fairly competitive way. But my argument here for Chun-Li, because this was my pick, is firstly her design. Her white boots and white buns contrast with the dark shadows of her legs, and you combine this with her spiky wristbands, and the character is very visually distinct, unique, and very clear to the player. And in a fighting game, knowing the full range of your body is super important, because fighting game characters essentially need to accomplish two things. They need to communicate clearly who you are and what range of control you have, but they also need to be exciting and interesting and attractive to play. And I thought Chun-Li was a good example of accomplishing this very well.
Yeah, I think she's definitely one of the most notable characters in the whole game, because I mean, when you think of Street Fighter, it's usually Ryu and Ken, but oftentimes it's actually Chun-Li. So I think that kind of notoriety also helps her position here.
Agreed.
So the category will gravitate towards characters with interesting arcs, personalities, or otherwise story elements. So it's rare that we actually get a nominee of a character for their visual design and iconic appeal.
Yeah, agreed. And I didn't pick her because she's like a babe or a waifu or something instantly recognizable. Even though those aren't terrible reasons in and of themselves, I'm sure someone could make an argument that way. But I picked her because she's the first female character in a fighting game and a step toward pushing the genre of fighting games and gaming and culture from being a boys' club into something everyone can enjoy. Other iconic female characters in the genre owe themselves to Chun-Li if they aren't derivative or overly sexual, such as somebody like Mai from King of Fighters. Chun-Li actually does a lot of good work, and I know that some people don't like some of the character designs in Street Fighter 2 from a more modern perspective because they feel like they lean too much into stereotypes. And I'm not going to say that they don't. I think there's definitely a push for that. But, the real spirit of the game is to have everyone loosen up. You find someone that you can vaguely identify with, and then you jump into the mismatch of the fighting game scene. So I think her having a warm reception also reflects this. And it's not this push to like force women to play video games or anything like that. It's just the idea that anybody can join in on this space, and I really appreciate that about fighting games.
Yeah, I think that also just really shows why the tournaments were so cool back then, because it's just like this huge community of people just coming to watch these people play a fighting game.
Yeah, and you kind of get into the spirit very quickly. It's shorthand, right? Instead of talking about like cultural nuance, you're able to just, okay, but what's the base level of it? I mean, Chun-Li even has a very interesting backstory. Originally they were going to have her be more kung fu based, and so she would have like a traditional garb that she would wear. And then they kind of strayed away from that with like the gauntlets. They give her the backstory of being a cop, and I think that's really cool too. I think a lot of people even today don't even know that about her, that she's actually like a police officer, and this is just like this alter persona that she puts on. I think it's cool when they take the time to look at a character and go, but that doesn't like interest me because it's too generic, it's too plain. Yeah, maybe it's more representative, but it's like not something that gets us excited. And so there is a real honest spirit, I think, to this as well. So I think that kind of sums up its standing in a number of different categories, or how well it could have potentially performed. As for talking about its nomination here in Best Pixel specifically, the main thing here is that it really did set the standard of fighting games for the future. Street Fighter 2 reinterpreted how games should feel. In particular, fighting games often gave off the impression of being easy for the programmer, but unintuitive and awkward for the player. And this is important, not just because Street Fighter 2 was more work to complete, but because it shifted the important focus on the experience of the player. So the mentality of the Capcom team really was for what makes a good player experience. And that's something that I do think is very important to the Oscarinas, because as an artist, you work to create something that other people can enjoy, and you want to make that a process that's interesting and engaging and intuitive. And so the fact that they said, we'll take on the burden this time with this game, instead of just clunkily throwing it together, let's actually do the hard work ourselves, so that way the player experience is really rich. And I just really admire their commitment to that.
Yeah, and again, going back to that video on how the game was made, like their dedication was crazy. Like the last 2 weeks, they spent a bunch of all-nighters just making sure all the bugs were fixed, making sure all the characters were properly animated. To go from fighting games that weren't really meant to be all that much to I'm gonna spend weeks of almost zero sleep to make sure this is properly done. Just a massive amount of respect to that group of people who created it.
It's definitely not good work culture wise.
Yeah.
You don't want people overworked, but at the same time, yeah, mad props to the commitment they had for this game for sure.
The first release of the game had a number of bugs and balance issues, but these were overcome because of the flavorful characters and the game's emphasis on head-to-head competitive play, which revolutionized the way fighting games were perceived at the time. This marks a major cultural shift in how the games are enjoyed, namely in the competitive sense. So again, going back to the massive tournaments where like hundreds of people would be gathered around to watch a couple people fight.
And yeah, that is interesting because it's a huge contrast from what happened at the time. Most fighting games were actually single player focused, which is just nuts to think about now because fighting games are so synonymous with their multiplayer head-to-head gameplay. But Street Fighter 2 was really the game that established that premise and solidified it as, yes, this is what this kind of experience should be like. And the usage of unique characters that reflect iconic imagery from nationalities across the globe in bombastic and expressive ways is both a win for player representation, but also the importance of artistic freedom of expression. It deliberately deviates from a realistic portrayal in order to have an easy point of connection between your fellow combatants. Sometimes when you're trying to make a connection with somebody who has a very different background than you, the idea of, well, let's take something that's simpler of both of our backgrounds to connect over makes a lot of sense. To share a little story, in college, I remember taking Japanese, and my professor, he was talking about how fusion restaurants used to really bother him because that's not really like faithful Japanese cuisine, like you're doing it wrong. Yeah. And then he said that he's come around in recent years because he thought, well, you know, the same thing happens when you go to Japan and you want to get American cuisine, like they change it based to accommodate the palate of people in Japan as opposed to people over here in the West. So all is fair. And the idea is that it gets you a window in the door. So if you're, you know, living in the US and you go out and get like let's say Thai food or something like that, it's going to have way more salt in it than you'd probably get in Thailand. It's going to be prepared in a different way. It's going to have a similar flavor, but it's going to be very, very Americanized, right? And the same goes for when you're in other cultures. But part of that isn't a bad thing because it can be that step in the door. It can get people excited and interested about it. You do need those entries that get people interested in it, and I feel like Street Fighter 2 was trying to go into that spirit. I don't feel like they were ill-intentioned. I actually think it was the opposite, and they wanted people to kind of bond over this experience and not get so hung up on the details of, you know, nuanced culture, because the spirit of the game just isn't going to be invested in that. And you could bemoan that all day long, but there is something to just creating a community space like you're describing with tournaments and things like that. And that's a very different focus that can't really be bothered with nuance of different cultural backgrounds because it's just a distraction to that conversation. Am I making sense? Does that ring true?
Oh, yeah, totally. Okay. And another thing that was really interesting is that when the game released in Japan, there wasn't that many like competitive play or even just people playing together because in that culture, you know, that's just something you wouldn't do. You wouldn't go play with a random stranger, which is why it was so big a hit in America because, you know, they were completely fine with that. And so just like seeing how even the popularity of the games were different because of how the culture was.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. I remember hearing about that as well, where most players in Japan didn't immediately take to Street Fighter 2, and it actually took a little bit of time. It's honestly kind of like McDonald's, because McDonald's actually changed the way that fast food was handled in like such a dramatic way. There was a movie about it called The Founder with Michael Keaton, and it's just really interesting to see how the model of McDonald's completely changed how fast food was handled, and in a lot of ways not for the better. But there was like certain things about it, like people had to get out of their car and go up and order their food, which they were not used to doing. You know, sometimes when you have something new to the table, it takes a little bit for culture to adapt, and a lot of times they don't. And so it's always interesting to see something that catches people's interest enough to where they actually lean in on it and they go, oh no, this is great. I initially had some pushback, but now I get it. There is something really cool and innovative about all this.
Yeah, and that's so important for different games to like grow, because if we don't have like these games like this that can push different cultural norms, then to a degree those games won't ever get like as popular. And so if we look in the FPS world, if games such as Doom or Quake didn't kind of change the cultural perspective on video games, then a lot of the games today wouldn't be made.
Yeah, I mean, we're really looking at a lot of classics this year, because even Myst, I would argue, goes into that camp as well, because that was a game that really pushed adults to be interested in video games and to like change perceptions about games being for kids as opposed to for everyone. So there's definitely a number of games this season that are touching on that really interesting point about what games can be and making us ask the right questions about just how far they can reach. And I think Street Fighter 2 definitely left a huge mark on multiplayer competitive play, even spectatorship, but getting a little bit into sportsmanship. And you know, the Oscarinas isn't really built to recognize games that are locked in their time, nor are they set up for games that depend on unquantifiable experiences like multiplayer. However, we do have an interest in that historical cultural impact. So more so when it is coming from a place of artistic craftsmanship. So the reason Street Fighter II succeeded was specifically because it harnessed artistic elements, unique characters, snazzy music, and a focus on player experience. We're definitely a player-focused academy. We just aren't necessarily Street Fighter II player base, and so I hope that's becoming clear why it didn't get more nominations. It could have scored those, it was on my list, but it kind of was difficult to get everybody to rally behind it when everyone wanted to talk about other things, because the way in which Street Fighter II is best experienced is largely sort of lost to time, and it's sort of a given in cultural context nowadays. So it's definitely worthwhile to revisit it, but yeah, I think that kind of helps explain why it has such a low nomination count.
Yeah, and all this aside, I think people are quick to cite video games as an artistic based on elements that don't actually have to do with art.
It is an art once art elements are harnessed and successfully achieve a desired goal. And such goals must be at least vaguely interested in the betterment of humanity, which in this case I would argue it is. So much has been said about Street Fighter II already that if you've got to play it yourself, I think you owe it to yourself to check it out, if for no other reason than to learn about the historical influence this game has had. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us tonight. The winners of the awards ceremony will be released this October. And if Street Fighter II wins Best Pixel, the Academy will have paid their dues to one of the most culturally significant games of all time.